Jai Prabhuji. Hello and welcome once again to the Retroprogressive Institute. My name is Radha Devi. I am a monastic disciple of Prabhuji, and here we are together exploring the book Tantra, Liberation in the World. This is a book, and we are at the beginning of our course. We had our introductory class, the class where we explore the subtitle of the book, which is Liberation in the World. Then in our last class, we delve into the introduction of the book itself. So today we're starting the first section, which is called the Tantric Vision. And we have the first chapter with the name The Essence of the Tantric Vision. I want to show it to you. And what we're doing today is that I found that just in the first paragraph, there is so much that we can share and develop from it. So I want us to begin by reading it. Tantra is a transcendental revelation with a completely original view of humans, the world, and life. We must delve into its fascinating essence to fully comprehend this religious and spiritual phenomenon. Many consider it to be a rebellion against society or institutionalized religion. However, Tantra is not interested in treating the symptoms. Instead, it focuses on the root cause of the disease, human conditioning. Human conditioning. In this class, we will focus on that root that Tantra identifies as the root cause of the human condition, which is conditioning. We will then explore its traditional meaning, a condition in the realm of psychology, and we are going to explore also what Prabhuji means when he refers to human conditioning. If we go to the dictionary of the Royal Spanish Academy, we find the following definitions in regards to conditioning. The first one is that it's the action and effect of conditioning, pretty simple. And then it says limitation or restriction, which is commonly used in plural, it says in the dictionary. So what we see is that in everyday usage, conditioning is going to refer to the imposition of a condition for a certain situation, a task, or an activity to occur. And an example will be in a sentence. Mary made a condition for Paul to always arrive before 7 a.m. to mow the lawn. Here, as the definition indicates, a limitation is set. The circumstances under which something can happen are restricted. So generally, by imposing a condition, some kind of restriction or loss of freedom is introduced. Next, I would like us to address conditioning in psychology, which is a notion that is extensively studied, and especially in the current of the behaviorism, which is this branch of psychology that focuses on the study of human behavior. We have behaviorism. It's also the foundation of behavioral therapy, which is used today as a treatment for various disorders, including addiction, the obsessive compulsive disorders, among others. And I am mentioning the fact that this is the foundation of this behavioral therapy because throughout the years we see these changes and they develop in psychology and different currents of psychology. We have psychoanalysis, behaviorism as the one that we are sharing a little bit about today. We have the humanism, we have the Gestalt. So there were many different opinions and experiments and different things that were brought in regards to behaviorism. But what I wanted to make an emphasis in this part where I'm mentioning that it does have a success in treating different disorders, even though now it's also combined with the cognitive therapy. So we will have the one that is a behavioral cognitive therapy. And so. This is not the main topic of our class, but just wanted to make this parenthesis. So in the field of behaviorism, we distinguish two main types of conditioning, which are the classical conditioning and the operant condition. And I will just like to briefly mention what's the meaning of each. In the classical conditioning, which was formulated by the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, it's commonly known for this famous experiment that he performed with the dogs. I don't know if you heard about it, but in this type of conditioning, one starts with a stimulus and a response, both of which are going to be initially unconditioned, but which after a certain process of association, they become conditioned stimulus and response. So in other words, a neutral stimulus, something that didn't cause any type of response, such as the sound of a bell. And in this case, we are mentioning from this example of the experiment that Pavlov conducted, it becomes associated with a response, which will be the salivation in dogs. And after repeated experiences, where the stimulus precedes the delivery of food. So in the experiment that he did, he used to he was sending certain scientists to give the food to the dogs. So what he noticed is that as soon as the dogs were hearing the sounds of the steps and they knew that the scientist was coming to feed them, they will start with the salivation process. So in this way, he said, okay, let me connect this response, right? It was a response to the steps of the scientist to a specific stimulus. So before the food was coming, he started to expose them to the specific stimulus of the ringing of the bell. And after a certain time, there was an association. So something that was a neutral stimulus or unconditioned stimulus became conditioned, because by a certain point, the dog started to relate to the ringing of the bell with the fact that the food was coming. And even though there was no food, they were starting to salivate as if the food was going to be present. So then we have, in contrast, the operant conditioning, which was developed by B.F. Skinner. He introduces the concept of reinforcement. So what we learn about classical, but here not only is a stimulus associated with certain response, but a reinforcement is added, which can be positive in a way of a reward, or it can be negative as a punishment. So the reinforcement, what happens is that it aims to increase the probability of a desired response. For example, a behavior that is strengthened by being rewarded or avoided if it brings with it a negative consequence, okay? So what we can deduce from reflecting on the concept of conditioning, both in its everyday use and also in the field of psychology, is that it is inevitably implies a restriction. This restriction is not only a limitation in behavior, but can be translated into a significant loss of our freedom. So in this sense, conditioning represents a contraction of the freedom that it's inherent inherent to being human. That same intrinsic freedom that we talk about in our class in regards to the subtitle of the book, Liberation in the World. So for those who did not have the opportunity to watch it, what I recommend is that you visit it, as in that class we delve into the meaning of freedom, how it differs from liberation, and why it is so important to why it was so important to use it as the subtitle of the book, Liberation in the World. Okay, so now to continue exploring the concept of conditioning within the context of the retroprogressive path, I would like us to share what Prabhuji expounds in his work in this book, Experimenting with the Truth. I think I already mentioned in this course that this book is a collection of questions and answers in which Prabhuji addresses very interesting topics for truth seekers that are related to meditation, to enlightenment, to self-knowledge, devotion, and many more. In this book, we have the question, what do you mean when you speak of human conditioning? And I want us to read how he begins his answers. He says, our authentic nature is covered up. From an early age, we have been grabbed in names, denominations, definitions, and concepts of who we are. They have dressed us up in endless social conventions, the products of our culture. Such mental covers do not allow us to perceive what we really are. We do not live from our nakedness, but dressed in clothes made of what we believe ourselves to be. So this first paragraph is only the beginning of a much longer answer that he offers in this article. Here, Prabhuji describes human conditioning as a covering. He refers to it as a garment that has been added or attached to our true essence. And this makes it, as we have been discussing even in colloquial definitions, an obstacle that prevents us from perceiving our true nature. So throughout the text, he continues to use the metaphor of clothing to refer to conditioning and contrast this with nakedness, which represents who we really are without these added layers of imposed ideas. This view, it's going to be, in my humble opinion, in complete harmony with the retroprogressive path approach, which tells us that enlightenment or liberation is not something that is obtained or added, but is what remains when we remove the illusory layers that concealed it. Later in this article, Prabhuji is telling us that the egoic phenomenon constantly urges us to hide under our mental clothing. So here, when we say mental clothing, he's referring directly to the conditioning, while the egoic phenomenon is going to be that disease that Tantra talks about, as we mentioned at the beginning of this lesson. We are born without any clothing. Then pure consciousness becomes covered by ideas, thoughts, concepts, and conclusions. Human conditioning is made of social garments that hide consciousness. This is something that we find after also in the same article, and when closing this class, we will explore whether it's possible to transcend human conditioning and whether there is a tool or something that can help us to do so. We will understand that transcending conditioning is the same as realizing what we are, what we many times call or refer to as enlightenment. In this article, Prabhuji is actually concluding by giving us certain guidance. But before we get there, before I share about it, I would like us to investigate further other references referring to conditioning. And now I want to do it specifically from the book Advaita Vedanta, Being the Self. This is the book. And we're taking different paragraphs of different sections of the book. The first one that I would like us to read says, Vedanta is intended for seekers of truth, for those who want to know their own reality and the reality of everything. Only those who aspire to liberation or moksha are qualified for Vedanta. Liberation from what? Liberation from limiting conditioning. In other words, from the mind. It takes a high spiritual level to aspire only to liberation from conditioning. Now, in this expert, we recognize how conditioning is going to be directly associated with the mind, which is a concept that aligns with what we have already discussed above. So here, the mind is seen as our memory, that storehouse of preconceived ideas, our habits, our family teachings, the social conditioning. And the text here reveals that the aspiration to free oneself from conditioning is a noble and a lofty quest proper to those who are thirsty to discover truth and their own reality. But something that I feel it's also very relevant to point out is the fact that the aspiration is a liberation from this conditioning. So there is a recognition of the obstacle that the conditioning represents. But now I want us to focus more in this relationship that it's putting in the mind, because this same idea is reinforced in another passage of the book, Experimenting with the Truth, in another section. And I would like us to read where Prabhuji mentions that unlike the brain, the mind is not a product of nature. The brain is organic while the mind is mechanical. The brain is an integral part of our physiology. The mind is a creation of society, a product of family, tradition, customs, institutionalized religion, and ideologies. Society shapes our mind and thus dominates us. Our mind is controlled both by politicians and organized religion. Transcending it means freeing ourselves from a foreign domination over our lives. One who has overcome the mind uses the brain and thinks free of conditioning. In this specific passage, we see how the idea of conditioning and mind are equivalent. I don't know if you notice how the words even that he's using in order to describe the mind were very similar of the ones that were used in the previous definition of conditioning. So conditioning is a social phenomenon, the result of external influences that are going to shape our psyche from a very early age. And liberation from conditioning then involves transcending the mind, a topic that we have also addressed before. So with this, I think that it's clear that when we speak of conditioning, we are also referring to the mind being the product of our accumulated experiences, traditions, teachings, is what keeps us in that conditioned state, in that conditioning that we are sharing and referring to. So to transcend the mind is to free ourselves from any type of conditioning, which is also equivalent to reaching a state of true freedom. In another mention of conditioning, Prabhuji writes, the intellect, due to its proximity to the self, is the highest mental faculty in sentient creatures. Its main functions are to observe, analyze, classify, discern, decide, discriminate, reason, and desire. Only a sattvic buddhi has enough clarity to perceive that which is subtle and recognize his or her own conditioning. For this reason, one of the main purposes of yogic sādhanā is to create sattva. Now, this passage introduces an additional dimension to the concept of conditioning that we've been sharing, and it leads us to the culmination of our class, where we will explore the transcendence of the human conditioning, the ability of the intellect, the buddhi, to recognize its own conditioned state. This is the addition that we're getting now. We see how the intellect must be purified, or rather be a sattvic buddhi, to discern the conditioning that binds us. So one of the functions of spiritual practice then is telling us that will be to refine the intellect so that it can see beyond the illusions that are created by conditioning. And as we will see in the section that is going to be dedicated to tantric sādhanā in more advanced classes, it serves to create the conditions for transcendence to occur. We will learn throughout the course, and if you saw, for example, the course of the Kundalini Yoga, that it is not something that we can force, this transcendence, this liberation or enlightenment. We cannot force it, but it's rather something that is given to us when we are ready to receive it. Thus, in the initial stages, the first step is to actually recognize the condition, for without this recognition, we could not even aspire to transcend it. This paragraph that we just read was from the book Advaita Vedanta, and I want us to continue reading from the same book. Every one of us can find that infinite stable space deep within and discover the permanent stability that is at the foundation of every experience. The only obstacle to recognize and consciousness is our conditioning. Vedanta suggests we commit to constantly recognizing consciousness at the root of every experience through meditation, which reveals the stable presence of what always remains. The only impediment to recognizing consciousness is conditioning, but it is possible to do so through meditation. As we also read in the end of the article in the book Experimenting with the Truth, now I can share it, where this question of what human conditioning was asked. We read here that to meditate is to observe our garments, physical, mental, emotional, and energetic, and gradually strip of ourselves. The retroprogressive process is to undress consciousness. Enlightenment is simply to be, abide in our authenticity, and live stripped of all clothes. For me, it is very important before continuing to know that we will never refer to meditation as a technique or a tool to obtain something else besides the meditation itself, but rather as a process of observation. As we sometimes express ourselves in the words of Prabhuji, it is seeing what is as it is, observing what is as it is. I want us to go deeper into this what we're bringing in regards to meditation with something that we find in the book, The Symbolic Turn. Normally, our consciousness is saturated with superfluous thoughts, like a mirror fogged by steam. The mind, in its usual state, resembles a roadway filled with constant traffic. Thoughts and narratives flow endlessly. Day after day, this mental activity persists, even at night. While we sleep, the mind is still active, dreaming, thinking, and worrying about the future. In contrast, meditation represents the absence of this mental traffic. It consists of a state of pure consciousness without mental interference and exempt from content. When thoughts cease, when desires cease to arise, a state of total silence is reached. This silence is the essence of meditation and where truth is revealed. Meditation is therefore transcendental to the mind or a non-mental state. The mind cannot lead us to meditation, for its tendency is to perpetuate itself. Meditation is found only by abandoning or renouncing the mind, by maintaining calm, indifference, by observing the pathing of thoughts without identifying with them. Meditation implies the recognition that I am not the mind. Meditation is not action but passion. It is not government but freedom. When contemplating the moon, the mind intervenes, labeling it as beautiful and triggering a succession of associations that lead us away from the moon and its true nature. Lost in a sea of thoughts, we forget the starry night. When observing the moon reflecting in a peaceful lake, simply be with it. Do not transfer it to your mind. Let it be an observed moon and not a thought moon. Keep words from interfering with your encounter with her. Just observe her being. No thought could capture its essence. In that attentive and conscious observation, leaving aside all thoughts or ideas, the moon will reveal to you the mystery of its reality. Do not put words over her. Do not grab it with concepts that make it darker. Let it be. Being you with it. In those moments, you will be meditating on the full moon. You can meditate on a flower, the sea, a cloud, a seagull, or a friend. Simply observing. Allow your gaze to be steady, intense, penetrating without allowing thoughts to interfere. Gradually, silent pauses will develop, bringing with them a deep, fresh peace. As the consciousness goes deeper or interiorizes, moments of silence arise, pure spaces, instances of transparency where nothing moves and everything is still. Transcending mental barriers dismantles the previous ties to access genuine freedom. There is no other effective way to transcend all conditioning or programming. In that stillness, it is possible to recognize our true identity and begin to decipher its mystery. I would like us to stay in what it felt like a guided meditation with these words that we just read. and just conclude by sharing how meditation, far from being a technique to obtain something, is more a synonymous of observation without the intervention of the mind. As we enter the tantric path, or any path that aspires to liberation and to recognize what we really are, we discover that the real challenge lies not in fighting the mind, but in recognizing that we are not the mind. Meditation invites us to that state of pure consciousness, which is free from the distractions and conditioning that is saturating our daily experience. As Prabhuji teaches us, meditation is not an action that we seek to perform, but I'll say that it's more a way of being, or rather just being. It is our presence in the moment and a silent contemplation that allows us to see things as they are without the distortions of our conditioning. He suggests how in the stillness of meditation, where thoughts fade and silence prevail, we can begin to perceive our true nature and to decipher this mystery of our existence. So then through this process, we transcend the mental barriers that have limited us, and we gain access to genuine freedom. That freedom, that liberation in the world that is pointed out in the subtitle of the book. Thank you very much for sharing with us today. Jai Prabhuji.